In late 1866, armed men in disguises rode at night across Tennessee, Georgia, and the Carolinas, moving in coordinated groups, following written instructions, and targeting the same kinds of people in town after town. They were not acting on impulse. They were enforcing a counter-revolution. The Ku Klux Klan had already begun operating as a paramilitary network built by former Confederate officers who understood command, secrecy, and terror as tools of control. This mattered because Reconstruction was working. By the end of the Civil War, the United States had abolished slavery and begun rebuilding the South under federal authority. Black men were voting in large numbers. They were serving as sheriffs, legislators, teachers, and militia officers. Land ownership among formerly enslaved people was growing in some regions. Schools were opening. Churches were becoming political centers. For the first time, black political power was not theoretical. It was visible, organized, and backed by law. That visibility triggered a response. The Ku Klux Klan did not emerge as random mob violence or spontaneous racial hatred. It formed between late 1865 and 1866. As a secret society with initiation rituals, ranks, passwords, and regional coordination. Its early leadership included men who had commanded Confederate units and who now applied military logic to civilian repression. Counties were divided into dens. Orders moved quietly between cells. Raids followed patterns. Targets were chosen deliberately. Black voters were attacked before elections. Black office holders were assaulted or killed. Teachers running black schools were threatened into leaving. Landowners were forced to abandon property. Ministers were whipped for hosting political meetings. Violence was timed, repetitive, and symbolic, designed to send messages rather than win battles. Local law enforcement often did nothing. In many cases, sheriffs and deputies were members of the same networks conducting the raids. Where arrests occurred, prosecutions failed. Witnesses were intimidated. Judges delayed proceedings. The message was clear. Federal law existed on paper, but enforcement was conditional. This is why the Klan functioned as an insurgency rather than a criminal gang. Its goal was not profit or chaos. It was political reversal. The organization aimed to destroy Reconstruction by making black political participation physically dangerous and by signaling that federal authority would not be defended at the local level. Fear was the mechanism. Withdrawal was the objective. Reconstruction governments understood the threat but were stretched thin. Federal troops were limited in number and unevenly deployed. Freedmen's Bureau agents documented violence but lacked enforcement power. Each successful Klan raid did more than harm its immediate victims. It tested the boundaries of federal resolve, and in many places, those boundaries held only briefly. By 1868, night riding had become widespread across large parts of the South. Armed men moved openly after dark, confident they would not be stopped. Victims recognized the attackers' voices, horses, and tactics, but secrecy rules ensured plausible deniability. Terror was personalized and anonymous at the same time. This escalation created a dangerous assumption that would soon prove false. The Klan believed it was operating against an unarmed population reliant entirely on federal protection. It assumed that once troops withdrew or hesitated, resistance would collapse. But the South was not only populated by newly freed civilians, it was also home to tens of thousands of black men who had fought a war. If you stay with this story until the end, you'll see how that single miscalculation, underestimating the military experience embedded in black communities, would force the Klan into direct confrontation, expose its operations to federal scrutiny, and ultimately reshape how Reconstruction-era violence actually unfolded on the ground. Reconstruction expanded black political power. Organized white terror rose to suppress it. And between those two forces stood people who had already learned how to fight, organize, and survive when law alone was not enough. By the time the Ku Klux Klan began riding openly at night, black communities across the South were not made up solely of newly freed civilians. They included a population that had already been trained for war. More than 180,000 black men had served in the Union Army during the Civil War, many of them in combat units, many of them as non-commissioned officers responsible for discipline, logistics, and command under fire. They returned home with experience that could not be unlearned. These veterans had marched in formation, guarded supply lines, and assaulted fortified positions. They understood patrol schedules, perimeter defense, and how to respond to coordinated attacks. Some had enforced order in occupied southern towns during the war itself, operating under federal authority against hostile populations. When Reconstruction began, their presence was not incidental. Federal officials relied on them as a stabilizing force precisely because they knew how violence worked. Weapons familiarity was widespread. Veterans knew how to maintain firearms, how to conserve ammunition, and how to avoid panic when shots were fired in the dark. Many had drilled repeatedly under stress, learning the difference between noise and threat. This knowledge circulated beyond the veterans themselves, shared within families, churches, and neighborhoods where military experience carried authority. During the early years of Reconstruction, many of these men served in state militias and local enforcement roles sanctioned by law. They guarded polling places, escorted officials, and protected schools. For a brief period, their authority was recognized. The same men who had fought to preserve the Union now stood as the physical guarantors of Reconstruction on the ground. That legitimacy did not last. As federal commitment weakened and white supremacist violence intensified, black communities were forced to confront a shift. Protection that had once come from the state began to fail. Troops were redeployed. Bureau agents were overwhelmed. Courts delayed action. Violence escalated faster than official response. Communities that had relied on federal backing found themselves increasingly exposed. The veterans noticed first. They recognized the signs of organized violence because they had seen them before. Coordinated movement at night. Multiple attackers operating with shared purpose. Targets chosen strategically rather than randomly. The Klan's raids looked less like crime and more like the kinds of operations veterans had faced during wartime. That recognition changed how communities responded. Rather than waiting passively for intervention, veterans began to advise preparation, not rebellion, not uprising, preparation. Homes were fortified quietly. Watches were established. Routes of approach were identified. Communities learned who could be trusted to respond under pressure and who could not. Leadership emerged organically, shaped by experience rather than formal titles. This transition was critical. It marked a shift from reliance on external protection to internal organization. Communities did not abandon federal law. They supplemented it. When elections approached, veterans coordinated security. When schools were threatened, guards were posted. When night riding increased, patrols moved silently along roads and fields, watching rather than provoking. The presence of veterans altered the balance of fear. Klan members expected unarmed targets who would scatter at the sound of hooves. In some areas, they encountered organized resistance instead. Shots were returned, raids were disrupted, riders were identified. The myth of total impunity cracked. This did not mean veterans sought open confrontation. They understood the risks better than anyone. Direct battles favored those with numbers, legal cover, and political support. The goal was deterrence, to make violence costly, to force attackers to reconsider whether every raid would end safely. In this way, military experience reshaped civilian survival. Veterans applied the discipline of war to the realities of peace under threat. They avoided spectacle. They minimized exposure. They acted collectively rather than individually. Their presence did not eliminate terror, but it constrained it. What made this resistance effective was not strength alone, but credibility. The Klan had misjudged the terrain it was operating in. It assumed fear would be one-sided. Instead, it encountered communities with embedded military knowledge, capable of responding in ways that could not be easily dismissed or crushed without escalation. The transition was quiet, uneven, and rarely documented in official narratives, but it marked a turning point. Black resistance to white terror was no longer improvised or isolated. It was grounded in experience earned on battlefields years earlier. The war had taught these men how to survive organized violence. Reconstruction would teach them when survival required using that knowledge again. By the late 1860s, resistance to the Ku Klux Klan is no longer a matter of individual courage. It becomes organized, local, and systematic. Across the South, Black communities begin building defense networks that mirror military logic without openly declaring themselves militias. The goal is not confrontation for its own sake, but control of space, homes, churches, roads, and polling places that have become targets of terror. These networks form quietly. Veterans meet with trusted community leaders. Churches double as planning spaces. Information moves through personal relationships rather than written orders. Nothing is centralized enough to be easily dismantled. Everything is coordinated enough to respond when needed. Armed patrols are established along the edges of Black neighborhoods and rural settlements. Men rotate shifts, standing watch at night when raids are most likely. Lookouts listen for horses, wagons, or unfamiliar movement. Signals are agreed upon in advance. A lantern in a window, a knock at a specific door, a runner sent down a dirt road. Response is measured in minutes, not panic. Polling places receive special attention. Elections are among the Klan's primary targets, and Black organizers know it. On voting days, veterans position themselves near entrances, not to intimidate, but to deter. The presence of armed, disciplined men changes calculations. In some counties, attempted raids never materialize. In others, attackers probe and withdraw when resistance becomes clear. Churches and schools are guarded the same way. These are not random targets. They are centers of Black political and educational life. Night watches protect buildings that represent autonomy and progress. When teachers are threatened, escorts are provided. When ministers receive warnings, patrols increase. The objective is continuity, ensuring institutions survive long enough to matter. What distinguishes these efforts from mob violence is restraint. Veterans insist on discipline. Weapons are carried, but not brandished. Shots are fired only when necessary. Engagements are brief, defensive, and localized. The aim is to disrupt raids, not pursue attackers. Everyone understands the risk of escalation. The point is to make terror unreliable. This discipline frustrates Klan operations. Raids depend on surprise and fear. When communities are alert and organized, those advantages disappear. Riders encounter resistance they did not anticipate. Some are wounded, some are unmasked. Names circulate quietly. Familiar voices are recognized. The anonymity that protects terror begins to erode. Newspaper accounts from the period describe armed Negro patrols and organized bands, often with alarmed or hostile language. What they reveal unintentionally is scale. These defenses are not isolated. They appear in county after county, adapted to local terrain, but guided by similar principles. The pattern is too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. Local officials respond unevenly. In some areas, authorities tolerate these defense networks because they stabilize conditions and prevent wider violence. In others, they move to disarm Black communities, enforcing weapons laws selectively. The same patrols that protect families at night become grounds for arrest during the day. Defense is reframed as disorder. Still, the networks persist. When formal militias are disbanded, informal ones remain. When patrols are banned, lookouts take their place. The structure adapts without disappearing. Veterans understand redundancy. If one method fails, another replaces it. The effect is measurable, even when unacknowledged. In areas with organized defense, raids decline or shift elsewhere. Terror does not vanish, but it becomes less predictable, less efficient. Communities buy time. Elections proceed. Schools reopen. Life continues under pressure, rather than collapsing beneath it. This phase marks a critical shift in the balance of power. The Klan remains violent and dangerous, but it is no longer unopposed. Its operations face friction. Its secrecy is compromised. Its assumption of helpless targets proves false. Black resistance during Reconstruction is not a series of spontaneous uprisings. It is a sustained campaign of protection, rooted in discipline and collective action. It does not seek publicity. It seeks survival. And as these defense networks spread, they force a new reality into view, one that federal authorities can no longer ignore. The terror is real, but so is the resistance. As resistance hardens on the ground, it begins to surface in the record. What had unfolded quietly at night, disrupted raids, armed patrols, failed attacks, now forces its way into federal awareness. By 1870, the violence in the South can no longer be described as isolated criminal acts, nor can black resistance be dismissed as rumor. The conflict has become visible enough, documented enough, that the federal government is compelled to look directly at what is happening. Freedmen's Bureau agents are among the first to report it clearly. Their field reports describe organized night riding by white groups and equally organized responses by black communities. They note instances where raids are repelled, where attackers retreat under fire, where entire groups of riders abandon operations once resistance is encountered. These reports are not celebratory. They are matter-of-fact, written by officials attempting to explain why violence continues despite formal emancipation. Newspapers begin picking up fragments of the same story. Accounts speak of armed Negroes standing guard at polling places, of unexpected resistance during night attacks, of masked riders fleeing after meeting prepared defenders. The language is often hostile, but the facts remain. Terror operations are being disrupted, not merely endured. By 1871, the scale of the violence and the failure of local governments to address it forces Congress to act. The Joint Select Committee to inquire into the condition of affairs in the late insurrectionary states convenes what become known as the Ku Klux Klan hearings. For months, witnesses testify under oath. Thousands of pages of testimony are recorded. What emerges is not only confirmation of widespread white terror, but repeated acknowledgement of organized black resistance. Black witnesses describe standing watch through the night. They recount returning fire when homes are attacked. They explain how patrols are formed, how warnings are shared, how communities mobilize within minutes. These testimonies are specific, consistent, and geographically widespread. They do not describe chaos. They describe systems. Former Klansmen testify as well, sometimes under protection. Their accounts inadvertently confirm what black communities already know. Raids are planned, orders are given, targets are selected in advance, and when resistance is encountered, operations are aborted or redirected. Armed defense works, not always, not everywhere, but often enough to change behavior. Federal lawmakers are forced to confront a reality they have largely avoided. Reconstruction violence is not one-sided helplessness. It is conflict. One side operates through terror and secrecy, the other through defense and discipline. Both are organized. Both are armed. Only one has been denied legitimacy. This recognition shapes federal response. Congress passes the enforcement acts, including the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, granting the president authority to suspend habeas corpus and deploy federal troops to suppress terror networks. For a brief period, the state intervenes decisively. Arrests are made. Klan cells collapse. Night riding declines sharply in some regions. But even here, resistance is quietly minimized. Official narratives focus on the suppression of the Klan, not on the role black communities played in forcing federal action. Armed defense is treated as an embarrassment, a complication to be smoothed over rather than acknowledged. The record preserves it, but memory does not. What the hearings ultimately reveal is not just the scale of terror, but the limits of federal tolerance. Black resistance is acceptable only insofar as it exposes the problem. Once acknowledged, it must be contained, regulated, and eventually dismantled. Order, not justice, remains the priority. Still, the documentation matters. It proves that black resistance to the Klan was real, organized, and effective enough to alter federal policy. It shows that terror was not met with silence. It was met with preparation, discipline, and resolve, even when recognition was denied. For a moment, the truth is unavoidable. White terror exists. Black resistance exists. And the conflict shaping Reconstruction is not hidden. It is recorded line by line, testimony by testimony, waiting to be remembered. By the mid-1870s, the balance shifts again, not because resistance has failed, but because political will has. Federal enforcement slows. Troops are withdrawn or redeployed. Funding dries up. The enforcement acts remain on the books, but their application becomes selective, then rare. What had briefly been confronted as an armed insurgency is gradually reframed as a local problem, best left to the states that enabled it. The consequences are immediate. Black militias and patrol networks, once tolerated as a necessary response to terror, are now targeted themselves. Weapons are confiscated under newly enforced or selectively applied laws. Leaders are arrested on minor charges. Communities that once organized openly are forced back into silence. Defense does not disappear, but it becomes fragmented, individualized, and riskier to sustain. White supremacist violence adapts. Where the Ku Klux Klan as a named organization collapses under federal pressure, its methods survive. Night riding gives way to quieter intimidation. Economic coercion replaces open raids. Violence becomes less spectacular, but no less effective. The goal remains the same: remove black political power without provoking renewed federal intervention. What fades most quickly is memory. Official histories record the fall of the Klan as a federal success story. They emphasize legislation and prosecutions while minimizing the role of black resistance that made intervention unavoidable in the first place. The image that remains is one of helpless victims saved by the state, rather than organized communities that forced the state to act. This erasure has consequences. Without acknowledgement of resistance, later generations inherit a distorted lesson: that terror was total, and that survival required submission. The truth is more complex. Armed defense worked often enough to disrupt raids, protect institutions, and expose conspiracies. It did not win Reconstruction, but it delayed its collapse and preserved lives that would otherwise have been lost. Black communities understood this even as public recognition vanished. Stories were passed down quietly. Names were remembered locally. Lessons survived in practice rather than print. How to organize without drawing attention. How to defend without escalating. How to survive when protection is conditional. The withdrawal of federal support reshaped outcomes, not capabilities. Resistance did not fail because it was ineffective. It was sidelined because it conflicted with political priorities. National reconciliation took precedence over black safety. Stability mattered more than justice. And once that choice was made, the space for organized defense narrowed sharply. Yet the legacy endured beneath the surface. The idea that terror could be met with discipline rather than panic carried forward into later struggles. Veterans taught younger men how to stand watch. Communities remembered that organization mattered. The memory of resistance shaped how later movements approached protection, even when tactics changed. How black people fought back against the KKK is not a story of final victory. It is a story of contested ground, partial success, and deliberate forgetting. Armed resistance proved viable. Federal abandonment reshaped the outcome. History recorded the laws. It forgot the people who held the line long enough for those laws to be written. The Klan was not defeated by fear alone. It was challenged, exposed, and disrupted by communities that refused to disappear quietly. That resistance did not end Reconstruction's collapse, but without it, the collapse would have come faster and at a far higher human cost. The terror faded from headlines. The resistance faded from memory. But it existed, and it mattered.